Good morning, everyone. This is Michael O'Malley here with a severe weather outlook and discussion recorded on April 29th, 2023, on 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot of things to go over today, so let's go and jump straight into everything. Taking a wide look across the contiguous United States today. First of all, we noticed much quieter weather out across portions of Texas where we had some very significant winds and even a couple of strong, potentially even intense tornadoes yesterday out across the Texas area. Wait for the official surveys to be done. But overall, this mesoscale convective complex has moved out into the Gulf of Mexico. We actually noticed that we have some remnant storms from this morning that brought that very significant wind out in southern Texas. That is now actually in the far southern Gulf, now almost into the Bay of Campeche vicinity. Elsewise, we have a developing mesoscale convective system to the south of New Orleans, this right over here. This will be moving eastward over the next several hours and will eventually impact the western Florida peninsula sometime late this afternoon into the early evening hours. Now, for today in Central Florida, we do have a level 2 out of 5 slight risk for severe storms. This runs from the Interstate 10 corridor from just east of Pensacola, Florida to near Jacksonville, Florida, back into portions of Georgia, including places like Savannah. And that severe weather threat extends all the way down to the Central Florida Peninsula, Tampa, Orlando, Palm Bay, Cape Coral, Fort Myers, Melbourne, some of those vicinities, even into Lake Okeechobee, and a level 1 out of 5 marginal risk from Pensacola down to Miami. And again, these risks could be increased later this afternoon. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Overall, the tornado threat is a 5%, meaning you have a 5% chance of seeing a tornado within 25 miles of a given point, mainly for later this evening. We'll talk about that here in a second, but that 5% area extends from just east of Pensacola all the way down to near Lake Okeechobee. 15% wind and 15% hail. That hail threat mainly confined to the eastern coast of Florida, with the sea breeze activity expected later this afternoon. Now, for this evening, we could have another round of severe storms, this primarily coming in the very late overnight hours into early tomorrow morning. Instability values are going to be the biggest question with this event. We're expecting moderate instability, 1,500 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. Generally speaking, from the Interstate 75 corridor southward to Miami, with only modest 500 to 1,000 mixed layer CAPE expected across the majority of the forecast area. Now, again, this is a somewhat moderate confidence forecast. We're not quite sure the response of the atmosphere post MCS. Basically, there's going to be a lot of convective overturning, and this is one of the things you have to think about if you're forecasting severe storms, that how is the atmosphere going to respond post MCS. And one of the things that we're kind of struggling with today is figuring out what exactly is going to happen. We have several different possibilities, from virtually no storms to supercells capable of producing strong, potentially significant tornadoes. So there's a lot of room for error in this forecast going into late this evening. And I want to highlight that there's anything from nothing to a full-fledged tornado outbreak that could occur across portions of the Central Florida Peninsula, depending on how much instability is able to come back and surge northward post the squall line that comes through later today. This is exactly what's out there right now, this developing squall line. You can see a large area of showers and thunderstorms encompassing the entirety of the northern Gulf of Mexico, and this extends pretty far to the south as well. And this is all moving eastward with time. So this is going to make it to the Central Florida coast here in the western coast of Florida and Tampa within the next about 5 to 6 hours. So sometime again, late afternoon, early evening, we expect this thing to be rolling through. Now, the shear for tonight won't be much of a problem. This is a pretty high confidence forecast. We've had relatively high confidence that there's going to be shear in the atmosphere for these storms to work with. And if any storms can get going, there definitely could be a threat for strong, significant tornadoes, especially from Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, northward into potentially southern Georgia and extreme southeastern South Carolina in the low country there as we progress throughout the very early morning hours into and after 2 a.m. Eastern time. So there's a pretty high confidence that we're going to have shear, but the problem is, are we going to have the instability? And for that, we're going to turn to some of the model forecasts now to look as to what might happen. So this is the HRRR, the 12Z run, and we're looking here at just the convective reflectivity. So we're just looking at a broad overview of what might happen. So we see these storms get going. This is our mesoscale convective system that we were just referencing. We notice that most of the Florida Peninsula actually remains relatively quiet throughout most of the day. Then we start to get those sea breeze storms as this MCS complex approaches. So this is about 21Z, so this is about 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern time. We've got cells developing along the eastern coast of Florida, and these could pose somewhat of a supercell risk. If you actually look here at a representative sounding based on the HRRR, this is just kind of a broad overview of what might happen. We notice that the tornado threat would be there if we can get any storm scale collisions or processes to occur that would lower our lifted condensation level or our cloud bases. But we notice that we do have veering. You can see southerly winds at the surface veering towards westerly or southwesterly winds aloft, and any supercells would be able to carve out a little bit of storm relative helicity. So there would be some shear. There's decent mid-level winds, although there is some backing here, but it doesn't really look like a 90-degree angle. So mesocyclones wouldn't be sufficiently, would not be really suppressed at this point based on some of the latest research that we're actually finding. Backing aloft is actually quite favorable. But we notice that, again, there's a pretty significant temperature dew point spread, 90 over 68. So roughly that is over a 15-degree temperature dew point spread, meaning our cloud bases are going to be quite high. But again, along some of those sea breeze boundaries and storm scale collisions between outflow and just other storm mergers, you could get those LCOs to come down just a bit to about 1,000 meters or less. That would support the threat for a few isolated tornadoes earlier in the day. So we're talking anywhere between 2 to 6 p.m., maybe even 7 p.m. the threat for a few isolated tornadoes along the eastern coast of Florida from these initial supercells that develop along the sea breeze. Now we notice that we have that complex of storms that comes in across north central Florida down towards the Tampa Bay vicinity at around 21Z as well. If we kind of take a little bit of a representative sounding, although this is a little bit convectively contaminated, we notice that we have generally uniform wind conditions at this point. A sounding from south of this convective mass, again, shows generally uniform winds, meaning there's not a lot of veering in the atmosphere, so tornado potential, at least further south, is going to be quite limited at this point. If we look at Daytona or near the Daytona Beach area at this time, again, kind of the same sort of thing. So there would be a large hail threat initially with these storms, these initial supercells, and I think damaging straight line winds possible with this MCS complex. And this might be a scenario where you get isolated large hail and damaging wind and maybe some attendant tornado risk with these supercells here, that we could see an upgrade to a wind-driven enhanced risk for this initial line of storms as they come in. Again, this line of storms will be weakening, though. We notice that, again, it transitions mostly to a wind threat now offshore. And that MCS here, just you can see remnants of it here by just about 9 p.m. This is actually 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 23Z. And most of the MCS is actually weakened and transferred to a new MCS off the coast here of Florida and Georgia. And then that moves into the Carolinas and offshore, and we get a rapid clearing here, rapid weakening of this initial MCS. So this is by about 6 a.m. now, or I'm sorry, this is 2 a.m. Eastern Time now at this point, 2Z. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not 6 a.m. or 2 a.m. My apologies. This would just be about 11 p.m. actually, my apologies. So this is 2Z, so roughly about 11 p.m., and we do have this, again, weakening of storms down to the south. So with southern extent, this MCS may not even reach South Florida at all. In fact, those storms pretty much weaken out and don't really make it to the Miami area. Maybe just some rain showers. Then by 6Z or 2 a.m., finally, we do have more cells starting to develop out here. And these could be our supercells that are developing. The HRRR goes for a broken band, actually kind of two bands of cells. You've kind of got this initial band, which seems like it could be broken in nature, so isolated supercells, and then maybe even a secondary band. We'll see. It does look like that this still is going to have just a little bit of instability to work with, but probably not much, and the photographs are a little bit less at this point. But again, generally speaking, we'll take a sounding from actually just south of the Tampa Bay vicinity here as these storms approach, and you notice that again, we're going to have very sufficient backing aloft. The photographs are very curved in the low levels. We are going to have a lot of storm relative inflow based on the photographs, and we're going to have very decent venting aloft given that we have strong upper level flow. Generally speaking, with ample instability and LCL heights that are right around 700 or less, we're going to have a very sufficient environment for tornadoes, some which could be strong to potentially intense tornadoes. Not going to see a huge tornado outbreak, but a localized outbreak would certainly not surprise me in the least. And then these storms do clear eventually as we progress throughout the morning into South Florida, where some attendant severe risk continues. If you look at the latest NAM 3 kilometer, again, these storms continue. We notice that MCS complex, numerous showers and storms developing along the East Coast sea breeze. That MCS actually does weaken a tad bit as it approaches the peninsula, and actually fully weakens just to leftover some remnant rain and cloud material. And then we notice that those supercells do end up developing here by about 9Z. If we kind of take a sounding here, this is close to Marion County. We're seeing elevated storms though, so that means the instability has not really had time to recover further north. If we take a sounding further south though, you get PDS tornado soundings here with a pretty decent photograph. A little bit of wonkiness here in the photograph though. But generally speaking, large cape, large low-level shear, over about 300 meters squared per second squared, 34 knots of a 0 to 1 kilometer shear. We're looking at cloud layer shear about 92 knots, so very effective, and SIGTOR parameters roughly about 4 to 4.5. This is high-end parameter space for Florida standards for late April. So this does tell me that someone could see a tornado tonight, and that someone could end up with a significant, potentially intense tornado based off of these soundings. LCL heights predictably are about under 500, so this means very low cloud bases. 3 Cape about 100, which means sufficient low-level stretching. This to me has all of these signs for what could be a potentially significant tornado event as we head throughout the evening. This is about 3 a.m. 3 a.m. tomorrow, and this has a look of a very favorable environment. Another sounding representative close to Tampa. Again, same sort of ordeal. SIGTOR parameter is about 3.5, which again is pretty high-end parameter spacing for the month of late April. So again, generally speaking, we're going to have a pretty favorable environment tonight. Would not surprise me to see this upgraded to an enhanced 10% tornado-driven risk for later this evening into the overnight. As far as our confidence level goes, again, still on the moderate end for tornadoes, but that is definitely trending upward with some of the latest guidance, so we'll continue to look over that and refine this as needed. Generally speaking, wind and hail threat, pretty high confidence that someone is going to see damaging winds and large hail today. And there is some attendant flooding risk as well, especially with multiple rounds of storms. You could see anywhere between 1 to 3 inches of rain. And given an already somewhat saturated environment from the past couple of days of heavy rainfall, someone is going to have some flooding issues to deal with tonight. So lots to kind of watch over, but again, definitely an attendant severe weather risk for this evening. Again, multiple rounds of storms possible, so have multiple ways of receiving your weather watches and warnings. All right. So that being said, of course, we'll be out there chasing this event. We'll have another brief update later in the day before we go chasing. Also, guys, have a good rest of your afternoon and evening. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll talk to you guys later.